Mom kicked out of bank. They had no idea she was the new CEO. Julia Bennett drummed her fingers on the steering wheel, humming along to the radio while waiting at a red light. Her 7-year-old son Tommy sat in the back seat, absorbed in his Nintendo Switch. The morning sun caught her wedding ring, or rather, where her wedding ring used to be. 3 years had passed since the divorce, but some habits died hard. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Hey buddy, ready to learn about money today? She asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. Tommy barely looked up from his game. Do we have to, Mom? Come on, it'll be fun. Think of it like leveling up in real life, Julia said, pulling into the bank's parking lot. She'd been coming to this branch for years, even before Tommy was born. The familiar brick building with its big blue sign had been the place where she'd opened her first savings account, applied for her mortgage, and later sorted out the messy financial details of her divorce. Julia checked her reflection in the car mirror, more out of habit than vanity. At 34, she still turned heads, though these days she wore less makeup and had traded her designer clothes for practical business, where that could transition from office to playground. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her navy blazer looked crisp despite having already survived a morning of meetings. Okay, game goes in my purse now, she said, holding her hand out as they got out of the car. Tommy surrendered his Switch with minimal protest, which she counted as a win. They walked toward the bank entrance, Tommy's small hand in hers. The glass doors slid open with a soft whoosh, releasing a blast of cool, air-conditioned air. Julia immediately noticed something was off. The usual friendly faces behind the counter seemed different today. Maybe it was her imagination, but the teller's smiles looked strained, almost forced. A couple of them exchanged glances as she walked in, the kind of looks she'd gotten used to as a single mom, a mix of judgment and assumption that made her skin prickle. Good morning, Julia said brightly, approaching the counter. She'd learned early on that sometimes the best defense was a good offense, in this case, being extra friendly in the face of cold shoulders. The teller, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain, barely looked up from her computer screen. Tommy shifted from foot to foot beside her, already bored. Julia squeezed his hand reassuringly. She'd been planning this visit for weeks, wanting to teach him about saving money and financial responsibility. As a finance professional herself, she knew how important these early lessons could be. Plus, she had to admit, she was proud to show him that his mom knew her stuff when it came to money. The branch was quiet for a weekday morning. Only a few other customers sat in the waiting area, filling out forms or staring at their phones. The gentle hum of conversation and clicking keyboards created that distinct atmosphere that all banks seemed to share, a mix of efficiency and forced politeness. Julia noticed a new security guard by the door, different from the friendly older man who usually worked mornings. This one watched her with slightly narrowed eyes, as if trying to figure out if she belonged there. She straightened her shoulders automatically, a reflex she developed over years of having to prove herself in male-dominated spaces. Can I help you? The teller finally asked, her tone suggesting she'd rather be doing anything else. Yes, I'd like to open a savings account for my son, Julia said, pulling out the folder of documents she'd prepared. She'd triple-checked everything they'd need, Tommy's birth certificate, her ID, proof of address, all the usual paperwork that came with any banking transaction. The teller's eyes flicked from Julia to Tommy and back again, lingering a moment too long on Julia's left hand, specifically, her ring finger. Julia resisted the urge to hide her hand under the counter. Instead, she placed her documents on the counter with the confidence of someone who'd spent the last decade in finance. I see, the teller said, barely glancing at the perfectly organized paperwork. And you're sure this is the type of account you want? Her tone suggested Julia might be better off buying lottery tickets. Tommy tugged at Julia's sleeve. Mom, I'm hungry. Just a few more minutes, sweetie, Julia whispered, reaching into her purse for the granola bar she always kept handy. Being a single mom had taught her to be prepared for everything. As she handed Tommy the snack, she caught two other bank employees whispering and looking her way. This wasn't exactly how she'd planned this morning. In her head, She'd imagined sitting down with a friendly banker who'd explain to Tommy how interest worked, maybe even give him one of those plastic piggy banks sometimes handed out to kids. She'd wanted him to feel excited about saving money, not bored and uncomfortable in a chilly lobby while his mom got the cold shoulder. Julia checked her phone quickly. She had a big meeting at 2 p.m. that she couldn't be late for. Her mind drifted to the stack of reports waiting on her desk, the emails she needed to answer, and Tommy's soccer practice later. Being a single parent meant constantly juggling, constantly planning 3 steps ahead. Some days it felt like walking a tightrope while juggling flaming torches. The teller was taking an unusually long time reviewing the documents, her lips pressed into a thin line. Julia recognized that look. She'd seen it countless times before. It was the look that said, "You don't fit my idea of what a proper bank customer should be." Julia had worked hard to get where she was. After her divorce, she'd thrown herself into her career, climbing the corporate ladder while making sure Tommy never felt like he came second. She'd earned her MBA taking night classes, studied for her financial certifications during Tommy's nap times, and built a reputation as someone who could handle complex financial strategies while keeping her humanity intact. But none of that showed on the surface. To the teller, she probably looked like just another young single mom who might not understand the complexities of banking. Julia felt her jaw tightening, but kept her professional smile in place. She'd learned long ago that getting angry only reinforced people's prejudices. "Perhaps," the teller said, sliding the documents back across the counter, "you might want to consider a different type of account. Or maybe a different branch." The suggestion hung in the air like a bad smell. Tommy had finished his granola bar and was now studying a poster about mortgage rates with exaggerated interest. Julia felt a flash of pride. Even bored, he was trying his best to behave. She'd raised him to be patient, to understand that sometimes grown-up things took time. But this was testing even her patience. "I've been banking here for 15 years, Julia said quietly, keeping her voice level. "I know exactly what type of account I want to open for my son." She pulled out her own bank statements, showing her substantial balance and perfect record. The teller's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or embarrassment. She still didn't reach for the new account forms. Julia felt that familiar pressure building in her chest, the one that came with swallowing your pride, with letting small injustices slide because fighting them took energy she needed for other battles. But this time was different. This time, her son was watching. She glanced at Tommy again, who was now tracing patterns on the marble floor with his shoe. He looked up and gave her a small smile, the kind that made her heart squeeze. She couldn't let him see her back down, couldn't teach him that it was okay to be treated this way. The morning light streaming through the bank's windows had shifted, casting long shadows across the lobby. A line was starting to form behind Julia, and she could feel the impatient shuffling of feet, hear the annoyed sighs. But she stood her ground, one hand on Tommy's shoulder. "I understand you're busy," Julia said, her voice carrying just enough authority to make the teller look up properly for the first time. "But I have all the required documentation here, and I'd appreciate it if we could proceed with opening the account." A man in an expensive suit brushed past them, heading straight for another teller who immediately greeted him with a warm smile. Julia felt Tommy tense beside her, and she knew he'd noticed the difference in treatment. Kids picked up on these things more than adults realized. The security guard had drifted closer, probably sensing the growing tension. Julia resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She'd faced bigger challenges than an unfriendly teller and an overzealous security guard. Running a department at one of the city's top financial firms meant dealing with difficult people daily. But something about this situation made her blood boil more than usual. Maybe it was because she'd built her career on understanding money, on helping others manage their wealth. Maybe it was because she'd spent countless nights studying financial regulations and market trends while Tommy slept down the hall. Or maybe it was simply because she was tired of being underestimated. "Mom," Tommy whispered, tugging at her sleeve again. "We can come back another day." That did it. Her son was offering to give up because he thought it would make things easier for her. He was learning the wrong lesson entirely. Julia squared her shoulders and pulled out her business card, sliding it across the counter. She watched as the teller's eyes widened slightly at the title, Senior Director of Investment Strategy. "I think," Julia said softly, so only the teller could hear, "we both know there's no legitimate reason not to open this account. So either we can proceed, or I can ask to speak with your manager about why your branch seems reluctant to serve certain customers." The teller's face flushed red. Without a word, she reached for the new account forms, her movements stiff and mechanical. Julia felt a small sense of victory, but it was hollow. She shouldn't have had to pull rank to get basic service. As the teller begrudgingly began processing their paperwork, Julia noticed another young mother entering the bank, pushing a stroller. The woman was wearing scrubs, probably just off a hospital shift, and Julia watched as the same looks of judgment followed her across the lobby. Nothing about this morning had gone as planned. What should have been a simple teaching moment with her son had turned into an object lesson in prejudice and persistence. Julia made a mental note to talk with Tommy about it later, to help him understand that sometimes standing up for yourself meant standing up for others too. The forms were finally ready for her signature. As Julia leaned forward to sign, she caught her reflection in the polished counter surface. She looked exactly like what she was, a capable professional and devoted mother. It wasn't her fault if others couldn't see past their own biases. Little did anyone in that lobby know that things were about to change dramatically. But for now, Julia just focused on keeping her hand steady as she signed the forms, showing Tommy how to write his name on his very first bank account. Despite everything, she was determined to make this a positive memory for him. The morning wasn't getting any better. After signing what felt like a mountain of paperwork, the teller slid a final form across the counter with all the warmth of a parking ticket. "This one needs to be notarized," she said, not quite meeting Julia's eyes. "You'll have to come back another day." Julia blinked. "Excuse me? That's not a requirement for a basic savings account." She'd opened dozens of these accounts for clients over the years. The teller was making things up, and they both knew it. Tommy had given up on standing still and was now slowly spinning in place beside her, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. A few other customers shot them annoyed looks, which the teller seemed to take as validation. "Well, in this case, we need additional verification," the teller said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "You understand, with children's accounts, we have to be extra careful." Julia felt her cheeks grow hot. Extra careful compared to what? The man who just opened an account without any questions? Or maybe compared to the couple over there who've been here half the time we have and are already done? The teller's expression hardened. "If you're going to be difficult about this, perhaps you should speak with management." She emphasized the word management like it was a threat rather than a solution. "You know what? I think I will." Julia gathered up their documents, her movements precise and controlled despite her anger. "Come on, Tommy. Let's go talk to someone who actually knows bank policy." As they walked toward the manager's office, Julia could feel eyes following them. She kept her head high, her hand gentle on Tommy's shoulder. He was being amazingly patient, but she could sense his discomfort. "Mom," he whispered, "did we do something wrong?" Julia's heart clenched. "No, honey. Sometimes people just don't treat others fairly. And when that happens, we have to speak up." The manager's door was open, revealing a middle-aged man in a gray suit who looked like he'd rather be golfing. His nameplate read Richard Morton, branch manager. He barely glanced up from his computer as they entered. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd rather not. Julia guided Tommy to one of the chairs across from the desk and remained standing. "Yes, I hope so. I've been trying to open a savings account for my son, but your teller seems to be creating obstacles that don't exist in your bank's policy." Morton leaned back in his chair, giving him the kind of look usually reserved for people trying to cash suspicious checks. "I'm sure our tellers are just following proper procedure. We have very strict guidelines about new accounts." "I'm well aware of banking guidelines," Julia said, pulling out her business card again. "In fact, I'd be happy to quote the exact policy regarding youth savings accounts. Would you like me to do that?" Morton glanced at her card, then did a double take. His expression shifted slightly, but the condescension remained. "Ms. Bennett, I understand you work in finance, but every bank has its own procedures." "First Federal's procedures are publicly available," Julia countered. I checked them before coming in today. Nowhere does it mention requiring notarization for a basic youth savings account. Tommy had pulled out a small notebook from his backpack and was doodling quietly. Julia had taught him that sometimes grown-ups needed to have serious conversations, and he'd learned to keep himself occupied. The sight of him being so mature while she dealt with this nonsense made her even more determined. "Look," Morton said, folding his hands on his desk, "perhaps this isn't the right time. Why don't you come back when you have all your documentation in orders?" Julia felt something snap inside her. Not the kind of snap that leads to yelling or scene-making, but the quiet kind that comes with absolute clarity. "Mr. Morton, let me be very clear. I have every required document right here." She placed the folder on his desk. "What I don't have is time for thinly veiled discrimination. Now, either you can help us open this account, or you can explain to your regional director why your branch is creating arbitrary requirements for certain customers." Morton's face reddened. "Are you threatening me?" "No, I'm stating facts. Your teller took one look at me, a young, single mother, and decided to make this process as difficult as possible. Your response has been to back up that behavior rather than address it. I'm simply telling you that I won't accept it." Tommy looked up from his notebook, his eyes moving between his mother and the manager. Julia wished he didn't have to witness this, but maybe it wasn't such a bad lesson after all. "Mom's really good with money," Tommy piped up unexpectedly. "She teaches me about saving and everything." The simple pride in his voice made Julia's throat tight. Morton had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I'm sure she does," he said, his tone still patronizing. "But you have to understand, we have procedures. Yes, you've mentioned procedures," Julia cut in. "Show them to me. Show me where it says you need different documentation for single parents. Show me where it says a notary is required for a youth savings account that requires nothing more than proper ID and a birth certificate." The silence that followed was heavy. Outside Morton's office, the regular sounds of the bank continued. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, quiet conversations. But in here, the tension was thick enough to cut. Morton cleared his throat. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. Let me look at your documents again." Julia watched as he flipped through the paperwork, knowing he wouldn't find a single thing out of place. She'd been preparing for this visit for weeks, not just gathering documents, but also researching bank policies and regulations. She'd learned early in her career that as a woman, especially a young, single mother, she had to be twice as prepared for everything. Morton shuffled the papers one more time, obviously stalling. Finally, he looked up with a forced smile. "Well, everything seems to be in order, but I'm afraid we're rather busy today. Perhaps you could come back next week?" Julia stayed perfectly still, her voice calm but firm. "No, I don't think we will. Tommy, honey, could you wait outside for just a minute? There's a nice waiting area right where I can see you." Tommy nodded, gathering his things. He was used to his mom having private conversations. She did it all the time at work. As soon as he was out of earshot, Julia leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Morton, I want you to understand something. Today, you and your staff haven't just insulted me. You've shown my son that it's okay to treat people differently based on how they look or their family situation. I'm not leaving until this account is opened, and I'm not coming back next week to go through this again." She watched as Morton's face went through several expressions: annoyance, embarrassment, and finally, resignation. He reached for his phone. "Sarah, please come to my office with the new account forms." His voice was clipped, professional. "And bring the welcome packet for youth accounts." Julia remained standing as they waited, her posture perfect despite the exhaustion creeping in. This wasn't how she'd wanted to spend her morning, but something told her it was important. Sometimes the moments that seemed like mere annoyances turned out to be turning points. Sarah, a different teller than the one who'd given them trouble, arrived with the forms. She was younger, and her smile seemed genuine as she handed them over. Morton dismissed her with a wave. "This shouldn't take long," he said, his tone making it clear he wanted them gone as soon as possible. As Julia filled out the forms, again, she thought about all the other people who might have walked away. How many other parents had been discouraged, turned away, made to feel less than worthy. The thought made her angry, but it also made her determined. "There," she said, signing the last form with a flourish. "I trust everything is in order now." Morton nodded stiffly, holding out Tommy's new account card. "We'll mail the welcome package to your home address." Julia took the card and gathered her things, her movements unhurried despite her desire to leave. At the door, she paused. "Mr. Morton, you might want to review the Equal Credit Opportunity Act with your staff, particularly the parts about discrimination based on marital status or the receipt of public assistance. Just a suggestion." She left him sitting there, his face a mix of anger and shame. Tommy looked up from his notebook as she emerged, his face brightening. "Did we do it, Mom? Did we open my account?" Julia smiled, but her mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She'd been looking for a sign, a push in a new direction, and maybe this was it. Sometimes the worst experiences led to the best opportunities.
"We sure did, buddy."
"How about we get some ice cream to celebrate?" As they walked out of the bank, Julia's phone buzzed with an email. She glanced at it briefly. A meeting confirmation for next week. A meeting that would change everything, though nobody in that bank could have guessed it. The morning sun was high now, and the parking lot was filling up with lunchtime customers. Julia helped Tommy into the car, her movements automatic while her mind worked through what had just happened. She had a choice to make: let it go, or use this as fuel for something bigger. Tommy buckled himself in, proud of his new bank card. "Mom, are we going to come back here?" Julia started the car, a small smile playing at her lips. "Oh yes, Tommy. We'll definitely be back." The next morning, Julia stood in front of her closet, fingertips running over her favorite power suit. Dark charcoal, perfectly tailored, with subtle pinstripes that meant business. She'd been saving it for today, though nobody at the bank knew that yet. "Tommy, honey, 5 minutes until Aunt Sarah gets here," she called out, hearing the familiar sound of cartoons from the living room. Her sister had been thrilled to help out, especially after hearing what happened yesterday. Julia checked her reflection one last time. She traded her usual ponytail for a sleek bun, added pearl earrings, and even dug out the expensive heels she usually saved for board meetings. The woman in the mirror looked exactly like what she was, a CEO ready for her first day. The doorbell rang, and Tommy's excited Aunt Sarah brought a smile to her face. Sarah burst in like a whirlwind of positive energy, already dressed for the playground date she had planned with Tommy. "Ready to knock some socks off?" Sarah asked, giving Julia a quick hug. "Man, I wish I could see their faces." Julia grabbed her briefcase, the nice leather one she'd bought herself after landing this position. "Just keep your phone handy. I might need to vent later." "Mom's gonna fix the bank," Tommy announced proudly to his aunt, though he wasn't quite sure what that meant. Sarah ruffled his hair. "You bet she is, kiddo. Your mom's basically a superhero, you know that?" Julia checked her watch, a gift from her old boss when she'd landed this position a month ago. The timing had been perfect, really. She'd kept quiet about the new job, handling all the preliminary work remotely. Today would be her first official appearance as CEO of First Federal Bank. "Okay, I'm heading out. Be good for Aunt Sarah, Tommy."
"Love you."
She kissed the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. "Love you too, Mom. Show them your superpowers." Julia laughed as she headed out. Kids had a way of making everything seem simpler. In their world, good guys won, bad guys learned their lesson, and justice always prevailed. Maybe today she could make that kid logic work in the real world. The drive to the bank felt different today. Same roads, same traffic, but everything had changed. Yesterday, she'd been treated like an unwelcome customer. Today, she was about to become everyone's boss. Life had a funny way of working out sometimes. Julia pulled into the reserved parking spot, her spot now, and took a deep breath. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mark, the head of HR, confirming he was already inside, ready to help with the transition. The bank looked different from yesterday. The morning sun hit the windows at the same angle, the same customers trudged in and out, but now she saw it all through new eyes. Every detail mattered: the slightly faded welcome mat, the fingerprints on the glass doors, the way the security guard seemed more interested in his phone than the customers. She walked in, heels clicking against the marble floor. The same teller from yesterday was there, already wearing that familiar look of judgment until she did a double take at Julia's appearance. Julia gave her a small, professional nod and headed straight for the staff entrance. The security guard jumped up. "Ma'am, that area is for employees only. Good morning," Julia cut in smoothly, holding up her ID badge. "I'm Julia Bennett, the new CEO. And you are?" The guard's mouth opened and closed a few times.
Tom.
"Thompson, ma'am. I'm sorry, I didn't dash. No problem at all, Mr. Thompson.
Just doing your job.
Though maybe we could be a bit more attentive to the front entrance? I noticed you were quite engaged with your phone earlier." She kept her tone friendly but firm, establishing authority without being harsh. The guard straightened up immediately, tucking his phone away. Mark was waiting by the staff entrance, his familiar face breaking into a grin. "Ready for the grand entrance?" "As ready as I'll ever be." Julia adjusted her blazer. Everyone gathered. Full staff meeting in the conference room, just like you asked. Though I have to say, some of them are a bit nervous about meeting the new CEO. "Good," Julia said quietly. "They should be." The conference room was packed. Julia could see Morton near the front, straightening his tie nervously. The teller from yesterday sat rigid in her chair, eyes wide as recognition slowly dawned on her face. Mark cleared his throat. "Everyone, I'd like to introduce Julia Bennett, our new Chief Executive Officer." The room fell silent. Julia stepped forward, her smile professional and warm despite the nervous energy crackling through the air. "Good morning, everyone. I'm sure some of you are surprised to see me. In fact, I know at least a few of you are, since I was in this very branch yesterday, attempting to open a savings account for my son." The silence in the room grew heavier. Julia could see Morton's face turning an interesting shade of red, while the teller seemed to be trying to disappear into her chair. Now, I could start this morning by focusing on what went wrong yesterday. But instead, I'd like to talk about what's going to go right from now on. She moved to the front of the room, her presence commanding attention without effort. Years of giving presentations and leading meetings had taught her how to own a space. First Federal has always been a good bank. But good isn't enough anymore. We're going to be exceptional. And that starts with how we treat every single person who walks through those doors. Julia clicked through her presentation, showing graphs of customer satisfaction scores, retention rates, and market share. She'd spent weeks preparing this, making sure every number told a story. You might wonder why I chose to visit this branch as a customer before starting officially. It wasn't to trick anyone or to play gotcha. It was because I needed to understand exactly what our customers experience. And yesterday showed me we have work to do. She paused, letting her words sink in. A young teller in the back raised her hand tentatively. "Yes?" Julia nodded encouragingly. "Ms. Bennett, what changes should we expect?" "Good question. First, we're implementing comprehensive customer service training. Everyone, and I mean everyone, will participate. Second, we're reviewing all our policies to eliminate any barriers that might unfairly impact certain customers. Third, we're establishing new metrics for success that go beyond just numbers." The room started to feel different. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism. Even Morton seemed to be listening intently now. "I believe in this bank. I believe in its potential, and I believe in every person in this room. But belief isn't enough. We need action. Starting today, we're creating a culture where every customer feels valued, regardless of their account balance, appearance, or family situation." Julia clicked to her final slide, a simple photo of a diverse group of happy customers. This isn't just about avoiding discrimination or following regulations. It's about building relationships, understanding needs, and creating a banking experience that makes people's lives better. That's what banking should be about. She closed her laptop, making eye contact with various staff members. "I'll be meeting with each department over the next few days. My door will always be open for your ideas and concerns. Together, we're going to make First Federal the kind of bank where everyone, including single parents with young kids, feels welcome." The meeting wrapped up, and staff members began filing out, many stopping to introduce themselves properly. Julia noticed the teller from yesterday hanging back, clearly wanting to speak but unsure how to approach. Morton approached first, his manner completely transformed from yesterday. "Miss Bennet, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for Dash." Julia held up a hand. "Mr. Morton, we'll have a proper meeting later today. For now, let's focus on moving forward." As the room cleared out, Julia took a moment to send a quick text to Sarah. Mission accomplished. "Tommy's going to love hearing about this." She smiled, thinking of her son's superhero comment this morning. Sometimes real power wasn't about wearing a cape. It was about being in the right place at the right time, ready to make necessary changes. The day was just beginning, and there was so much work to do. But standing in that conference room, looking out at what was now her bank, Julia felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't about getting even. It was about getting better. 1 week into her new role, Julia sat at her desk reviewing customer feedback forms. Her office, with its wall of windows overlooking the city, still felt a bit surreal. She'd replaced the stuffy old furniture with more modern pieces, added some plants, and put up a few of Tommy's drawings. It made the space feel more like her, professional but human. "Ms. Bennet." Her assistant, Rachel, poked her head in. "The branch managers are ready for your video call." Julia checked her watch. 9 a.m. sharp. "Thanks, Rachel. And remember, it's Julia." She clicked into the video conference, facing a grid of faces representing all 23 branch managers. Some looked eager, others apprehensive, and a few, mostly older men, seemed slightly resentful. Morton, she noticed, was sitting up straight and taking notes. "Good morning, everyone," Julia began, shuffling through customer comment cards. "I've been reading some interesting feedback. Mr. Parker in Denver, would you like to explain why one of your tellers told a teenager she was too young to understand investing?" Parker coughed nervously. "I wasn't aware of that incident." "That's part of the problem," Julia said, keeping her tone conversational. "We're missing too many of these moments." The customer was 16, had saved $2,000 from her part-time job, and wanted to open an investment account. Instead of encouraging her interest in finance, we shut her down. She took her money to our competitors. The silence on the call was heavy. Julia let it sit for a moment before continuing. "But here's the good news. We can fix this. Starting next week, we're launching our Future Investors program. Any customer showing interest in investing, regardless of age or initial deposit, gets connected with one of our financial advisors for free consultation." She could see some managers perking up, while others looked skeptical. "Won't it take up too much of our advisor's time?" someone asked. "Actually," Julia pulled up a spreadsheet, "our analysis shows that early engagement leads to longer customer retention." That 16-year-old with $2,000? In 10 years, she could be a young professional with significant investment needs. But she'll remember which bank took her seriously from the start. The conversation shifted as managers began sharing their own experiences and ideas. Julia smiled, watching the energy change. This was how progress started, one conversation at a time. After the call, she grabbed her coffee and headed down to the main floor. She'd made it a habit to spend at least an hour each day watching customer interactions, sometimes stepping in to help during busy periods. The staff had been nervous at first, but they were getting used to seeing their CEO in the trenches with them. The main floor was buzzing with typical morning activity. Julia noticed Lisa, the teller who'd given her trouble that first day, helping an elderly couple. Her demeanor had changed dramatically since the customer service training. She was patient, helpful, and actually smiling. "The system's a bit slow today," Lisa was explaining. "Would you like some coffee while you wait?" Julia made a mental note. A week ago, Lisa would have just let customers sit there getting frustrated. Small changes, big impact. Her phone buzzed, Tommy's school. For a split second, her heart jumped, but it was just a reminder about the upcoming parent-teacher conference. Being a CEO hadn't changed the daily juggling act of single parenthood. "Julia?" Mark from HR appeared at her elbow. "Got a minute?" There's some pushback about the new training schedule. They walked to the break room, which was empty except for a young teller quickly finishing a sandwich. "Let me guess," Julia said, refilling her coffee. "The senior staff don't think they need basic customer service training?" Mark nodded. Davidson in commercial lending is particularly vocal about it. Says it's a waste of his time. Interesting. Julia stirred her coffee thoughtfully. Pull the customer satisfaction scores for his department. And Mark, get me the demographic breakdown of loan approvals while you're at it. She had a feeling about Davidson. People who resisted basic training usually had the most to learn. Back in her office, Julia found an email from Sarah with photos of Tommy at the park. She smiled. He was showing off his bank card to his friends, proud as could be. Her son's simple faith in her ability to fix things kept her going on tough days. The afternoon brought a parade of meetings, budget reviews, marketing plans, and a lengthy discussion about updating the bank's mobile app. Julia kept pushing for simpler language, clearer instructions. But these are standard banking terms, the tech lead protested. They're standard to us, Julia corrected. To a first-time banking customer, they might as well be ancient Greek. Let's make it accessible for everyone. By late afternoon, she was reviewing Davidson's department numbers. The patterns were exactly what she'd suspected. Loan approvals skewed heavily towards certain demographics. Time for another conversation about unconscious bias. Her desk phone buzzed. Ms. Bennett? There's a situation in the lobby you might want to handle personally. Julia found a young man in ripped jeans arguing with a teller about check cashing fees. He had paint on his hands and looked exhausted, probably a contractor trying to cash a client's check. Hi there. Julia stepped in smoothly. I'm Julia Bennett, the bank's CEO. What seems to be the issue? The man blinked, thrown off by her direct approach. They want to charge me $30 to cash a check from one of your customers. I don't have an account here. Julia nodded, checking the check amount. $2,800. You're a contractor? House painter. Just finished a big job. Tell you what, if you're interested, we can open an account for you right now. No minimum balance, no monthly fees for the first year, and we'll waive the check cashing fee today. The painter looked suspicious. What's the catch? No catch. Just good business. You work hard. You deserve a bank that works for you. 20 minutes later, the painter left with a new account and a smile. The teller looked at Julia in amazement. But the policy dash, sometimes we need to look at why policies exist, Julia explained. Are they serving our customers or just our convenience? Back in her office, Julia found an email from Davidson. He'd heard about her requesting his department's numbers and wanted to meet. Progress, even if it came from pressure. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. Can I show Jake my bank account tomorrow? Julia smiled, typing back. Sure, buddy. Maybe Jake's parents would like to open one for him too. She'd been at the job just a week, but already things were shifting. The morning huddles she'd instituted had staff talking to each other more, sharing experiences. The customer feedback cards were showing small improvements. Even Morton had come around, proving to be surprisingly innovative once he got past his initial resistance. The sun was setting when Julia finally packed up for the day. She had a stack of reports to read at home, but Tommy's bedtime story came first. As she walked through the lobby, she saw a young mother with 2 kids being welcomed warmly by Lisa. Would you like me to show you our youth savings accounts? Lisa was saying. They're great for teaching kids about money. Julia smiled to herself as she headed for the parking lot. Change was happening one interaction at a time. It wasn't always easy balancing everything. The demands of the job, single parenthood, her vision for the bank, but moments like this made it worth it. Her phone buzzed one last time. A message from Sarah. Tommy told his whole class his mom's a superhero who runs a bank. Pretty sure you're now the coolest mom in 3rd grade. Julia laughed, starting her car. Sometimes the best changes weren't the big policy shifts or training programs. Sometimes they were as simple as a kid being proud of his mom, or a painter getting his first bank account, or a teller learning to smile at every customer. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she was exactly where she needed to be. 1 month into her role as CEO, Julia sat in the monthly board meeting, presenting numbers that had everyone smiling. Customer satisfaction scores were up 15%. New account openings had increased by 23%, and their mobile banking app reviews had jumped from 2.5 to 4.2 stars. Impressive results, said Gerald Walsh, the head of the board, peering over his reading glasses. Particularly the Youth Accounts Initiative. Julia nodded, clicking to the next slide. We've opened more accounts for customers under 21 in the past month than in the previous quarter combined. The boardroom hummed with approval. These were the kinds of results that made everyone happy, clear, measurable improvements that looked good on paper. Julia should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt uneasy. After the meeting, she walked through the main branch, coffee in hand. The place looked different now. Plants brightened the corners, the harsh fluorescent lights had been replaced with warmer ones, and there were comfortable chairs where the rigid plastic ones used to be. Lisa, now promoted to lead teller, was training a new employee. Remember, Julia overheard her saying, "We treat everyone like they're our most important customer." It should have made her proud. The staff was using the right language, following the new procedures. Customer complaints had dropped dramatically, but something still felt off. Back in her office, Julia found an email from the painter who'd opened his account that first week. He'd referred 3 other contractors to the bank. Small victories, she thought, but real ones. Tommy's latest art piece hung on her wall, a crayon drawing of what he imagined her work looked like, complete with a cape-wearing figure behind a desk. Mom's Super Bank was written across the top in wobbly letters. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Lunch? Got some interesting bank gossip for you. Julia needed a break anyway. She grabbed her purse and headed to their usual cafe down the street. Sarah was already there, looking like she might burst with news. "Okay, spill it," Julia said, sliding into the booth. Sarah leaned forward. "So I was at my yoga class, and there was this woman complaining about First Federal, your branch specifically. What happened?" Julia asked, stirring her iced tea. She said everyone was super nice, almost too nice. But when she tried to get a small business loan, she got the runaround. Said it felt like they were smiling while showing her the door. Julia frowned. "Did you get her name?" "Better." Sarah pulled out her phone. Got her card. "She runs a cleaning service. Maria Rodriguez." Julia jotted down the name. Something clicked. She'd seen that application cross her desk, marked as pending further review. Standard language for applications that were being quietly discouraged. "You've got that look," Sarah said. "The one that means someone's about to get there, but kicked." "No butt kicking," Julia sighed. "Just reality kicking in. We've changed the surface. But the deeper stuff? That's harder." Back at the bank, Julia pulled Maria's application. Everything looked solid. 3 years in business, steady growth, good credit. The only red flags were invisible ones. Female, Hispanic, small business owner. She buzzed Rachel. "Gemi Davidson from Commercial Lending." Davidson arrived looking confident until he saw Maria's file open on Julia's desk. The cleaning service application," he said smoothly. "We're just being thorough like we were with the construction company that applied last week. Similar financials, faster approval. The difference?" "That was a completely different dash. The difference," Julia cut in, "is that one owner is named John Smith and the other is named Maria Rodriguez." Davidson's face reddened. "Are you suggesting dash?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm showing you data." Julia pulled up a spreadsheet. "Pattern recognition is what I do, Mr. Davidson. Would you like to explain these patterns to me?" The afternoon stretched into evening as Julia dug deeper into the bank's lending patterns. The surface changes, the smiles, the better customer service, the welcoming atmosphere, were masking deeper issues. Like painting over cracks in a wall without fixing the foundation. Her phone buzzed. "Tommy's after-school program, Mom. Can you come? Jake's being mean about the bank thing." Julia grabbed her keys. Some things couldn't wait. She found Tommy sitting alone in the program coordinator's office, trying not to cry. "Hey, buddy." She sat next to him. "What happened?" "Jake said he said you're not a real boss because you're a girl. And his dad says banks are for men to run." Julia felt that familiar mix of anger and sadness. "Even here, even now. Tommy, look at me. You know what's funny? Jake's dad probably has to answer to women bosses all the time. He just doesn't like to admit it." Tommy sniffed. "Really? Really? And you know what else? Some people don't like change. When things are different from what they're used to, they get scared or angry. But that doesn't make them right." Back at the bank, working late, Julia started drafting a new memo. The customer service training had been a good start, but it wasn't enough. They needed deeper changes in lending practices, in hiring, in how they evaluated opportunities. Her email pinged. Maria Rodriguez had received her loan approval, expedited by Julia herself. A small victory, but not a systemic one. Morton knocked on her door. "Ms. Bennett? Got a minute?" He looked uncomfortable. "I've been reviewing our small business loan data, like you asked. And, well, you should see this." The numbers were worse than she'd thought. The pretty veneer they'd created was hiding years of institutional bias. Julia stared out her office window at the darkening sky. They'd won the first battle, made the bank feel welcoming, improved surface-level interactions. But the real work was just beginning. Her phone lit up with a text from Tommy. "Mom, I told Jake that my mom's gonna make banks better for everyone. That's true, right?" Julia smiled, typing back, "You bet, buddy. No matter how long it takes." She pulled up the bank's mission statement on her computer. Time to rewrite it, from the ground up. The false victory of better customer service scores wasn't enough. Real change had to go deeper. Tomorrow, she'd start again. Different approach, same goal. Because sometimes the hardest part of change isn't starting it. It's pushing through when you realize how far you still have to go. Julia woke up to Tommy shaking her shoulder. She'd fallen asleep on the couch again. Laptop still open, papers scattered everywhere. "Mom, we're gonna be late. You said we'd do pancakes today." She blinked at the clock, 7:15.
Damn.
She'd promised Tommy breakfast together, a rare morning where they could take their time instead of rushing out the door. "I'm sorry, buddy. How about we grab something on the way?" Tommy's face fell, but he nodded. He was getting too good at hiding his disappointment, and that scared her more than any banking crisis. The drive to school was quiet. Julia caught glimpses of Tommy in the rearview mirror, playing with his bank card, his proud possession that lately seemed more like a reminder of how much she was missing. "Hey, what if we do pizza and movies tonight?" she offered. "To make up for breakfast."
Can't.
"I have soccer, remember?"
Right. Soccer.
She'd missed the last two games, stuck in emergency board meetings about the new lending policies she was trying to push through. Dropping him off, she noticed other parents in workout clothes or casual wear, looking relaxed as they walked their kids to the door. She was already in her business suit, yesterday's makeup hastily refreshed, running on coffee and determination. At the bank, her inbox was flooded. The commercial lending overhaul was causing waves. Davidson had rallied some old guard supporters, claiming her changes were reckless and bad for business. Rachel appeared with more coffee. "Your 9 o'clock is here." And Tommy's school nurse called. "Something about a form you were supposed to sign last week?" Julia closed her eyes briefly. The medical release for his field trip. She'd put it in her important pile, which had gotten buried under loan applications and policy drafts. "I'll handle it during lunch," she said, knowing lunch would probably be another granola bar eaten during a meeting. The 9 o'clock turned into a 10 o'clock, then an 11 o'clock. Julia found herself mediating between department heads who were resistant to change and younger staff members eager for reform. "We can't just throw out decades of lending experience," Davidson argued in the conference room. "No one's throwing anything out," Julia countered, her patience wearing thin. "We're adding new metrics, considering different types of collateral, looking at success patterns we've been ignoring. And our default rates? Have you seen the numbers on women-owned businesses? Lower default rates than traditional corporate loans. We've been leaving money on the table because of outdated assumptions." Her phone buzzed, Sarah asking if she was still up for Tommy's soccer game. Julia typed a quick "trying" and turned back to the meeting. By afternoon, her head was pounding. The board was pressuring her about quarterly projections, worried that her focus on social issues was distracting from the bottom line. "Ms. Bennett," Rachel poked her head in. Tommy's school called again. He forgot his soccer gear, and the after-school program needs to know if he's staying late today. Julia checked her calendar. She had back-to-back meetings until 6. "Can you call Sarah? See if she can dash. Sarah's got that job interview today, remember?"
Right.
Another thing she'd forgotten. Julia rubbed her temples, feeling the day spiraling out of control. An email popped up from Gerald Walsh, board members expressing concerns about recent policy changes. Emergency meeting called for tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning. when she'd finally promised Tommy she'd make it to his school presentation. He'd been practicing his speech about community helpers all week, proud that he could talk about his mom's job. Her computer pinged with another complaint about the new lending guidelines. The words blurred together as she stared at the screen, wondering when doing the right thing had gotten so complicated. By evening, Julia was running on autopilot. She'd missed Tommy's soccer game, sent Sarah a rambling apology text, and was still at her desk reviewing policy documents. A knock on her door made her look up. Morton stood there, looking uncomfortable. "Ms. Bennett, you should see this." He handed her a printout, an internal email chain she hadn't been copied on. Davidson and several other department heads were building a case against her changes, claiming she was emotionally driven and compromising the bank's standards. "They're presenting this to the board tomorrow," Morton said quietly. Julia stared at the words emotionally driven, feeling a bitter laugh bubble up. Because wanting fair lending practices was emotional, but their fear of change was somehow rational. Her phone lit up with a text from Tommy. "It's okay about soccer. Jake's dad missed his games too, when he got divorced." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Is that what Tommy thought? That she was absent like his dad had been? She gathered her things quickly, suddenly needing to be home. The papers could wait. The emails could wait. Her son couldn't. The house was dark when she got there. Sarah had left a note. Tommy had eaten, done his homework, and gone to bed. A paper was stuck to the fridge with a magnet, his presentation notes for tomorrow, written in careful third-grade handwriting. "My mom helps people at the bank," it read. "She makes sure everyone gets treated fair." Julia sank onto the couch, the day's weight finally hitting her. She was trying to change a system that had existed for generations, and the system was fighting back. Not just with policy arguments and board meetings, but by taking her time, her energy, her presence in her son's life. Her phone buzzed again, more emails about tomorrow's board meeting. She ignored them, walking to Tommy's room instead. He was asleep, his bank card on the nightstand next to a school photo of them together. She sat on the edge of his bed, gently brushing hair from his forehead. "I'm sorry, buddy," she whispered. "I'm trying to make things better, but I'm messing up the most important thing." Tommy stirred slightly. "Mom, hey, just checking on you. Go back to sleep. Are you coming to my presentation tomorrow?" Julia looked at her phone, at the email about the emergency board meeting. Sometimes you had to choose your battles. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Tomorrow, she'd face the board. She'd fight for her changes, defend her vision. But first, she'd watch her son talk about community helpers and what it means to make things fair. Because sometimes the highest price isn't the one you pay at work, it's the one you pay at home. And Julia was starting to realize that finding the right balance wasn't just about changing the bank, it was about changing herself too. Julia sat in Tommy's classroom, watching him stand in front of his classmates in his slightly wrinkled shirt. She'd missed the board meeting for this, and she couldn't bring herself to regret it. "My mom runs a bank," Tommy said, holding up his poster. "But not like other banks. She makes it fair for everyone." The other parents smiled politely. Julia noticed Jake's dad shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Good. She says money isn't just for rich people," Tommy continued. "It's for everyone who works hard and needs help making their dreams come true." Julia felt her throat tighten. Somehow, her 8-year-old had summed up her entire mission better than any corporate memo she'd written. After the presentations, Tommy ran to her, beaming. "Did I do good, Mom?" "You did amazing, buddy." She hugged him tight, breathing in his familiar mix of kid shampoo and crayon wax. "Hey, how about we grab breakfast before I head to work? But don't you have important meetings?" Nothing more important than this. Over pancakes, Julia watched Tommy demolish a stack of chocolate chips and whipped cream. Her phone buzzed constantly, but she kept it face down. Something had shifted in her mind during his presentation. "Mom," Tommy asked, syrup dripping down his chin. "Are you in trouble at work? What makes you say that?" "I heard Aunt Sarah talking about mean people trying to stop you." Julia wiped his chin, considering her answer. "You know how your video games, sometimes the hard levels take more than one try?" Tommy nodded. "Well, sometimes grown-up stuff is like that too. You have to find different ways to win." When Julia finally walked into the bank, she felt different.
calmer.
The morning rush was over, and she could see her staff handling things smoothly without her hovering. Lisa was teaching an elderly couple how to use the new banking app. Morton was personally helping a young entrepreneur with loan paperwork. Even Davidson looked up from his desk and gave her a tentative nod. In her office, Rachel waited with a stack of messages about the missed board meeting. "They're pretty angry," Rachel said carefully. "Good," Julia replied, surprising them both. "Sometimes people need to be uncomfortable before they can change. But first, I need you to help me with something." Together, they cleared her desk completely. Every paper, every file, went into neat piles on the conference table. "Now," Julia said, pulling out a fresh notebook, "let's rebuild my schedule from scratch." She blocked out breakfast with Tommy 3 times a week. Soccer games went on the calendar as unmovable meetings. Every Wednesday afternoon became community connection time. No executive meetings allowed. But the board dash, Rachel started. "We'll get better results when their CEO isn't running herself into the ground," Julia finished. "Now, get me Davidson and his team. It's time for a different approach." Davidson arrived looking wary, his supporters clustered behind him. Julia had set up the conference room differently. Round table instead of rectangular, no power seat at the head. "Sit down, everyone. Let's talk about what we're really afraid of." The conversation with Davidson's team lasted hours, but this time it was different. Instead of pushing changes from the top down, Julia listened. Really listened. "We're not against fair lending," Davidson admitted finally. "We're worried about being blamed if the new approaches fail." "Then let's build safety nets," Julia suggested. "Pilot programs, shared responsibility. You've got decades of experience. Help me make this work." By afternoon, they had the outline of a new plan. Traditional metrics would stay, but with new categories added. Experienced lenders would mentor younger staff on risk assessment, while learning new ways to evaluate non-traditional applications. Julia called an all-staff meeting, but not in the conference room. They gathered in the lobby, where customers could see them. "Look around," she said. "Every person who walks through those doors has a story, a dream, a need. Our job isn't just to protect the bank's assets, it's to help those stories have happy endings." She saw heads nodding, saw the pride in her people's eyes. They wanted to do good, they just needed to know how. "From now on, we're not just changing policies, we're changing perspectives. And we're doing it together." That evening, Julia left work on time. She had dinner with Tommy, helped with his homework, and actually watched a movie without checking her email once.
"Mom?"
Tommy asked as she tucked him in. "Are you still a superhero if you come home for dinner?" Julia laughed. "Maybe I'm a better superhero because of it." The next morning, she arrived at work to find Davidson waiting with a new proposal. His team had stayed late, excited about the possibilities they discussed. "We thought about what you said," he explained. "About stories having happy endings." The proposal combined old and new approaches beautifully. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Maria Rodriguez stopped by for a loan review. This time, Davidson handled it himself, asking questions about her business expansion plans with genuine interest. Julia watched from her office, smiling. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Tommy says you made chocolate chip pancakes this morning. Who are you, and what have you done with my workaholic sisters?" The bank was changing, but so was she. The revolution she'd wanted to lead was happening, just not the way she'd first imagined. It was slower, steadier, more inclusive. She picked up a framed photo from her desk. Tommy at his first soccer game after she'd taken the CEO job. Back then, she'd been too busy checking emails to see him score his first goal. "Rachel," she called out. "Block out Thursday afternoon. I've got a soccer game to attend." Sometimes going back to familiar ground didn't mean giving up the fight. It meant finding better ways to win it. 6 months had passed since Julia's pancake breakfast revelation. The bank lobby hummed with a different energy now, less corporate tension, more community warmth.
"Mom, look."
Tommy pointed at his youth account statement as they walked through the main entrance. "My savings grew again." Julia smiled, remembering that first difficult day trying to open his account. Now, kids with their parents were a common sight at First Federal, thanks to their new family banking program. "Ms. Bennett," a familiar voice called out. It was the house painter, the one from her first week as CEO. He wasn't in paint-splattered clothes anymore. He wore a clean polo shirt with his company logo. "Just wanted to say thanks," he said, gesturing to the small business loan officer he'd been meeting with. "Just got approved for a company van. Business is really growing." Tommy tugged at her sleeve. "Can I show him my new bank card? It has a rocket ship on it." The painter grinned, pulling out his own card. "Hey, mine too. Your mom let us vote on the new designs." Julia watched them compare cards, remembering the argument she'd had with marketing about maintaining professional aesthetics. But rocket ships had won out over corporate logos, and their youth accounts had tripled. The morning light streamed through windows that now held children's artwork alongside rate notices. A sign announced free financial literacy classes in English and Spanish. Small changes that added up to something bigger. In her office, Julia reviewed the quarterly reports with a smile. The board members who'd once questioned her social agenda were notably quieter now that the numbers showed solid growth. "Your 9 o'clock is here," Rachel announced. "It's Maria Rodriguez." Maria walked in confidently, carrying a thick folder. "I brought something to show you." She spread out photos of her cleaning business's new eco-friendly vans, employee uniforms, and a recently opened office space. "We're now the preferred service provider for 3 corporate buildings downtown." "That's fantastic," Julia said, genuinely excited. "How's the new hiring program working out?" "We've hired 6 single moms so far. Flexible schedules, fair pay, and guess where they all bank now?" They shared a knowing look. Maria had become more than a success story. She was now on First Federal's Small Business Advisory Board, helping other entrepreneurs navigate the system. A knock at the door interrupted them. Davidson stood there, looking almost unrecognizable from the resistant department head he'd been 6 months ago. "Sorry to interrupt, but you might want to see this." He handed over a financial industry magazine. First Federal was featured in an article about innovative community banking practices. Julia skimmed it, noting phrases like revolutionary approach and model for industry change. "They want to give us an award," Davidson said, trying to hide his pride. "For inclusive banking practices. Give us?" Julia raised an eyebrow. Davidson grinned. "Hey, I'm learning. We did this together, right?" That afternoon, Julia left work early for Tommy's soccer game. She sat in the bleachers, cheering loudly, noticing other bank employees there too. Morton watching his granddaughter play, Lisa cheering for her nephew. "Quite a change from last year," Sarah said, settling beside her with snacks. "Remember when you used to spend games checking emails?" Julia watched Tommy dribbling down the field, his team's jersey sporting the First Federal logo along with other local business sponsors. The bank was part of the community now, not just in it. "Jake's dad actually smiled at you today," Sarah noted. "Never thought I'd see that." "Well, after we approved his business expansion loan, he had to admit maybe women do understand banking." Tommy's team won, and Julia found herself surrounded by parents she now knew by name, many of them First Federal customers. The barriers between bank and community had softened, become permeable. Back home, Tommy proudly added his participation trophy to the shelf next to Julia's recent Community Banking Innovation Award. "Mom," he asked, doing homework at the kitchen counter while she cooked dinner, another change from their previous takeout routine. "Remember when you said you were going to fix the bank?" "Mom,
Did you?"
fix it, I mean." Julia stirred the pasta sauce, thinking about it. The bank was different now, more accessible, more humane. But maybe the bigger change had been in her, in finding a way to be both a force for change and a present mother. "I think," she said carefully, "we made it better. Not perfect, but better. Like my soccer? Coach says I'm better, but I still need practice." Exactly like that. Her phone buzzed, an email about tomorrow's board meeting. 6 months ago, it would have sent her into preparation overdrive. Now, she glanced at it and set the phone aside. Tomorrow would take care of itself. The evening news played quietly in the background, a story about First Federal's new community investment program. Tommy looked up from his homework. "Hey, that's your bank." "Our bank," Julia corrected. "Remember how hard it was to open your first account?" Tommy nodded. "But now lots of kids have accounts. And their moms and dads don't get the mean looks anymore." Julia hugged him, amazed at how much he'd noticed, how much he understood. The bank had changed, She had changed, but some things remained constant, like the warmth of her son's hugs and the importance of standing up for what's right. Later, as she tucked Tommy into bed, she noticed his bank card on the nightstand, rocket ship gleaming in the nightlight's glow. Next to it lay his piggy bank, the one she'd finally gotten the bank to give out to kids. "Good night, superhero mom," Tommy mumbled sleepily. Julia smiled. Sometimes the biggest changes weren't in policies or procedures. Sometimes they were in the small moments: a mother making it to soccer games, a bank teller learning to smile at everyone, a community learning to trust their local bank again. She had changed the bank, but the bank had changed her too. And somehow, in finding the balance between revolution and evolution, she'd found herself as well.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.